Throughout the years, I have read various books and articles on experiences of spiritual awakening and revival, where revival happens among God's people. They are revived. Spiritual awakening happens among those who are lost. They are awakened for the first time. There is one particular book that I have in my library. It's called Revival Fire. It was written by Wesley Duell. Some of you are familiar with him. And he essentially goes through the history of God's people, talking about special movements of the Spirit, some of which are revival, that is God's people being reawakened. And it seems that revival almost always leads into awakening. That is, it impacts the community so that lost are saved. It starts with God's people. In one chapter of his book, he talks about what some have called the Fourth Great Awakening in America. It happened in 1857 through 1859. Mostly it began in prayer meetings up in the northeastern part of our nation. And of course, you know, in those years, that was kind of the prelude to the Civil War, which 1861 it began. And many thought that because that revival of those prayer meetings was taking place up north, and because of the schism of the country, that it would be hard for it to spread across into the South. And yet Wesley Duell writes about an experience that took place during the Civil War. And I read to you, he says, because of the bitter tensions of the Civil War and the slavery issue, for a time it seemed that the southern states would not be as powerfully influenced by the revival as the northern ones had been. Others dispute this assumption. An unusually powerful revival broke out among the southern troops stationed around Richmond, Virginia in the autumn of 1861. It began in the hospitals, among the wounded men, and then spread into the camps as these men returned to active duty. Prayer meetings were organized and hundreds were converted. The movement spread rapidly throughout the army, reaching the troops of Tennessee and Alabama. Revival was encouraged by many of the generals. By the midsummer of 1863, the revival had spread throughout all the southern armies, and thousands of men had been converted. Chaplains and lay missionaries went out among the troops, preaching and distributing tracts, dealing personally with the hungry hearts. By the end of the war, at least 150,000 soldiers had been converted, and more than a third of all the southern troops had become praying men. It had been mostly a prayer revival. Revival awakening cares nothing for whether a country's split or not. It can pass and move wherever it wants to. I hear oftentimes people using the phrase, then in America, we've kicked God out of schools. And that oftentimes makes me chuckle. The idea that the sovereign God of the universe, who created all things in 6 days by the power of His Word, is kept out of any school is laughable at best. God will go wherever He wants. Revival, awakening, it crosses all borders, all boundaries, all races, and all people. And one of the things I have seen and studied and learned is that when churches are revived, it tends to impact the community into what we might call an awakening. And when these awakenings happen, I'll tell you, there are some repercussions that oftentimes are unexpected. This morning, I want to talk to you a bit about the aftermath of an awakening. If you have your Bibles, you can turn to the book of Acts, chapter 19. Acts, chapter 19. As we continue in our study through the book of Acts, here's our primary thought for the day, if you will. A spiritual awakening can cause unexpected changes and interruptions in a community. A spiritual awakening can cause unexpected changes and interruptions in a community. God, when He is at work reviving a church or awakening a community, He's not really concerned about whether it fits within convenient schedules or convenient times or experiences or our patterns or our habits. It comes, and sometimes it has impacts that we may or may not anticipate. In Acts chapter 19, we're going to be looking at verses 21 through 41 today. We began weeks ago, several weeks ago, in verse 1 of chapter 19, as Paul entered the city of Ephesus. By the time we hit verse 21, he will have been in that city preaching for about 2 years. This is his third missionary journey. And so we're coming farther to the end of the book of Acts, farther to the end of his last missionary journey. Some of the things that have happened in Ephesus, where he initially came across a group of people who had been under the baptism of John, but had not received the Holy Spirit. And so Paul shows up, and they receive the Holy Spirit, and a very unique event takes place, and they are radically changed. And then later, a group of Jewish exorcists, the sons of Sceva, they see Paul casting out spirits. They see Paul doing some very unique things in the city of Ephesus, and they think, hey, we want to get in on this. And so they begin to try to cast out spirits in the name of the God which Paul calls upon. They were beaten about half to death and attacked by the demonic spirits who didn't know who they were. And it was such an impact on the community that these spirits would be so powerful, and yet that Paul's preaching would be more powerful. An awakening took place to the degree that in all the occultic studies and all the materials, the occultic materials in town, particularly those related to the temple of Diana or Artemis, depending on your translation, what it's called. All the things related to that temple of Artemis and all the materials the people had, they began to bring to the town square and burn up. They began to get rid of them. People became so convicted, people became so changed that according to the Scriptures, and depending on the scholars or the commentators you read, the books that were brought to the town square totaled somewhere in the range of anywhere from a low of $3 million to a high of $6 million. Either way, that's a lot of stuff. People begin to get saved, and they begin to change. Guess what? When you are born again, God changes you on the inside. And that inevitably is going to affect the outside. It just is. And so for them, their change was to get rid of their occultic materials and to move on without them. Well, here's the problem. Paul had been in Ephesus for almost 2 years, and mostly no one of any real importance had paid a lot of attention to his preaching. People had been being saved. But when the guys who were in the business of providing materials for the occultic worship of the temple of Artemis, when folks stopped buying their materials, then they got involved. In fact, the story we're about to read is going to show you of a guy who became very upset at the fact that because people had stopped buying the materials and people were getting rid of the materials, his business was hurting. People who worked under him, their business was hurting. And in almost 2 years of Paul's preaching, this guy never paid much attention until it began to affect his pocketbook. You read stories in history of awakenings that have happened in towns and in cities and businesses. Liquor stores and gambling casinos and things have been affected because people's behaviors have changed. People's habits have changed when they get saved. Changed so much so, some of these businesses are affected. If you read the history of spiritual awakenings, you'll see these things impacted. I would suggest to you folks, if we want to see our community changed, it will begin by seeing one heart at a time changed. Warner Robins is a city of, 70, 72,000 people, give or take. Houston County is about 100,000. You had Bibb and Peach. We've got, well over 100,000, 200,000 people in this area. Well, let's just take Warner Robins, 70 to 72,000. Let's say there are 20,000 people in Warner Robins truly saved. What happens if all of a sudden 30,000 or so, an extra 10,000 people are saved? That's going to affect the town. What happens if an extra 20,000 are saved? And now instead of just 20,000 in the population truly saved, you've got 40,000, more than half the population truly saved. It is going to impact how people spend. It's going to impact how people act. It's going to impact how people behave. And so the church is not here to change the community. The church is here to declare Christ and see souls change. And when souls change, that then impacts the community. And certainly we should be involved at times in political activities and certain other community and civic activities, but that's not our primary deal. Our primary deal is to see people's hearts changed. They, in turn, act differently in the community. That changes the community. And so when you see a spiritual awakening, what you see happening is a kind of a mass conversion, and it changes communities very quickly that way. So what are some elements of surprise we might see in this type of awakening? I don't know about you, but I pray on a regular to semi-regular basis, God, bring revival in Green Acres Baptist Church. Bring revival in the churches of Middle Georgia in such a way that it impacts this community in an awakening. I can't honestly say that I've ever personally been in a true awakening, not like the kind I read about. But I got to tell you, I pray that God would let me experience one before I leave this earth. Pray, God, I read about these revivals. I read about these awakenings. I read about them in the Bible. Cities like Nineveh that were completely converted. I got to be honest with you. I think God can still do that. I don't know about you. I'm convinced He can still do it. I read about the awakenings that happened in America, first, second, third, fourth Great Awakenings. I read about the Welsh revival. I read about revivals that are taking place right now in countries from to Africa to the Middle East to all over, and just huge outpourings of Christians taking place. And I believe God is still capable of doing that. I firmly believe that. And so if that were to happen, if that took place, what are some things that we might see, that we might want to be aware of as we move forward, much like this awakening took place in Ephesus? We'll pick up in verse 21 as we begin our study. When these things were accomplished, that is the book burnings, if you will, the occultic material trashing, getting rid of all that, people being saved, when all that stuff happened, Paul purposed or set in his mind or decided. Paul decided in the Spirit when he had passed through Macedonia and Achaia to go to Jerusalem, saying, after I have been there, I must also see Rome. So just a clarification, he's in Ephesus. He's already planning his next step. Lest you think Paul's missionary journeys were haphazard, they were pretty well structured and planned out. They were structured and planned out, and yet they were open to the Spirit of God when God moved him to different places. We know early in the book of Acts, Paul tried to go north, God sent him west. Paul tried to go north again, God sent him west. And so he plans these things out and prepares them ahead of time, and yet is open to what God might do to change things along the way. So here it says he's planning to go back through Macedonia. You remember Macedonia? Philippi, Thessalonica, Berea, all up and down that area that we looked at earlier. And he also wants to go through Achaia, that is Corinth. Paul will eventually go back through those places and collect an offering that he will ultimately take to Jerusalem. But in this moment in verse 21, he's thinking about this. He's planning it in his mind there in Ephesus. So he sent into Macedonia two of those who ministered to him, Timothy and Erastus, but he himself stayed in Asia for a time. That's Ephesus. So relative to his plan to go over into Macedonia, he went ahead and sent Timothy and Erastus as kind of his lead men, if you will. Particularly construction tends to have those kinds of groups. You have a team that goes on ahead and prepares the way so when the whole construction team shows up, they're ready to build. You have lead men who go ahead and prepare the way. Well, Paul had that. He had guys who would go on ahead of him and kind of prepare the way and get things ready so when he showed up, they could continue on the work that they planned to do. In verse 23, and about that time, there arose a great commotion, or stir, if you will. Confusion. Confusion is a great explanation of this or word. No small commotion, I believe the King James says. And about that time, there arose a great commotion about the way, which was a reference to the Christians. One of the things we see when spiritual awakening happens and people begin to get saved and things begin to change is the ministry doesn't stop. Just because great things are happening, just because a lot of people are getting saved, just because there are conversions taking place, that doesn't mean that the ministry somehow stalls so we can sit around and look at how great things are. The ministry continues to take place. So here is Paul in Ephesus, All of these massive amount of conversions are taking place. People are walking away from the occult. Confusion is starting to take place, but Paul's thinking of his next step. We had a pastor's roundtable that took place a couple of months ago at one of our local churches. And literally, they had a table, set up in a big round shape, and we all sat around it. And the first part of the day, we did a lot of interaction, and later, after lunch, came back and talked about different kinds of things. And one of the notes that one of the pastors who was leading it made a statement about that I really appreciated was, we don't always wait until things happen to determine to do something about them. We try to look forward and make plans and anticipate. I love that statement, Pastor Mike. I don't know if you remember that. I think one of the lead pastors said that was there. And so this is Paul. Paul doesn't always wait until something happens to react. And too often in the church, if we're not careful, we do that. One of the things we do each year as a church, in January, the last Sunday of January, we have a Vision Sunday. Last year it was Vision 2018. This year it'll be coming up Vision 2019, where we have kind of a vision casting service, and then we have a ministry fair. Part of that is to look ahead and say, what can we begin to really move out on for this year and focus on for this year as a ministry priority for the year? Doesn't mean we don't do other things. Doesn't mean we don't plan to do other ministry events, but we kind of look out ahead and try to anticipate what can be the most effective thing that we could kind of set our eyeballs on this coming year. We've already kind of been preparing for that as a pastoral staff, and that last Sunday in January, we'll do that this year. Well, one of the things we see here in Ephesus is Paul going, look, all this is great. In Ephesus, we're seeing awakening happen, but I'm not just going to sit back and enjoy the fruits of my labor. We got more people to win. We got more places to go. And so the ministry will continue onward even when great things are happening. The ministry will continue onward. The commotion arose, it seems like, at about the same time Paul was conjuring up his next plan. One characteristic of Paul's ministry was consistency. One character, I don't consider myself anything spectacular or special, but the one thing God's enabled me to do is just not quit on things. One thing God's enabled me to do is just to say, well, whatever's happening, let's get up. Let's put on our pants. Let's go back into the next day and keep going. Let's get up. Let's get dressed. Let's brush our teeth. I know it may have been bad yesterday. Who knows what the day holds? And maybe today is going to be bad too, but we're still going to try to press forward through it. And so that's what we see about the Apostle Paul. I came across a story this week about a runner named Beth Ann DeCiantis. She was trying to qualify for the Olympic marathon back in 1992. She was trying to qualify for that Olympics. And a female runner who wants to qualify for an Olympic marathon must run the marathon race in less than 2 hours and 45 minutes. 2 hours and 45 minutes, that's the time. Anything above that, you don't qualify. I'm going to read to you the story that I read about her. Beth started strong, but began having trouble around mile 23. She reached the final straightaway at 2 hours and 43 minutes. Remember, she's got to finish it in 2 hours and 45 minutes or under. With just 2 minutes left to qualify, 200 yards from the finish. Now, most of us, 200 yards, we can run 2 minutes easily, but not when it's your 26th mile, right? 200 yards from the finish, she stumbled and fell, dazed. She stayed down for 20 seconds. The crowd was ticking. 2 hours and 44 minutes, less than a minute to go. Beth Ann staggered to her feet and began walking. 5 yards short of the finish, with 10 seconds to go, she fell again. She began to crawl. The crowd cheering her on. She crossed the finish line on her hands and knees, and her time was 2 hours and 44 minutes and 57 seconds. I don't know if you've ever felt like that. So I think I feel like that sometimes. Sometimes we're not running down that last straightaway. We're crawling. But I got to tell you, here's one thing that's true. No matter what God's doing in our lives and no matter how good things are going, there's still more ministry to be done. And as great as we might see things, maybe we look at the past of Green Acres and say, look at all the great things that were done. We praise God for that, but that's not all. Look at all the great things God's doing now, but that's not all. We always have more that's left to be done. And so no matter how good things may be, no matter how tough things may be, the ministry will continue onward as we go. Look at verse 24. For a certain man named Demetrius. Demetrius, let's just call him the big boss. And you'll see why. Demetrius. A silversmith. He was more than a silversmith. I don't think Demetrius was the guy who actually did the silversmithing. He was the guy that had people working under him. He was the boss, and he had a lot of contractors working under him that he contracted out work. He had gotten so large. He was now an executive in the office, and he had a lot of guys working under him that had small silversmith businesses. You'll see that here in just a moment. For a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, who made silver shrines of Diana, brought no small profit to the craftsmen. That is, he got all this business and he channeled it out into all of his subcontractors, if you will, who then actually made the little statues or the little idols of silver. Verse 25, he called them together, his craftsmen. He called them together with the workers of similar occupation. We have a union here. What we have is a silversmith union coming together for a meeting. Local 234, whatever it was a silversmith union. He called them together with the workers of similar occupation and said, men, you know that we have our prosperity by this trade. So the first thing he talks to them about is their economics, right? Let's just get down to business. Gentlemen, we make our living by Artemis and all the stuff that we make to worship Artemis. Verse 26, moreover, you see and hear that not only at Ephesus, but throughout almost all Asia, this Paul has persuaded and turned away many people, saying that they are not gods which are made with hands. Next, he deals with the practicality of it. The first is the economy, the second is the practice. Now look at verse 27. So not only is this trade of ours in danger of falling into disrepute, mentions the economy again, but also that you guys might going to lose your jobs if you don't stop Paul, right? If you want people to listen, you can talk about their spiritual worship, but you start talking to them about losing jobs, then they start listening. But also the temple of the great goddess Diana may be despised and her magnificence destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worship. Now let me say this. There is no indication here that Paul said anything about Artemis or Diana. At least we don't have that recorded. We don't have it recorded. All we see is Paul lifting up Jesus. Paul didn't go after Artemis, Diana. He didn't go after the temple. He lifted up Jesus. And when he lifted up Jesus, so many people got saved, they walked away from Artemis, the worship of Artemis. See, our key factor in evangelism is not attacking the pagan culture. It's lifting up Jesus. And as people begin to get saved, they'll walk away from the pagan culture. Us standing there hollering and complaining about the culture does very little. Us standing there declaring Christ to the culture does a lot. So what we have here is the president of the local union workers and the big boss of the silversmith trade giving himself a speech. And it's a nice speech. He does a good job. And he talks about the economy, and he talks about their trade and their jobs. And then, oh yeah, also Diana too, her reputation, or Artemis' reputation. And in the midst of all this, he lays out a very confusing objective. Paul wasn't out to destroy Artemis. He was about to see people saved. And yet, he's painted as a man who is their enemy. Watch this. When we see awakening take place, when we see revival, when we see people saved, when we see God doing something, the men may confuse the objective out in the culture. People may look and they may confuse what we're really trying to do. Christians are trying to propagate hate. Have you ever heard that? Christians are trying to propagate intolerance. No, we're not. We're trying to lift up Jesus Christ. We're trying to, look, I get it. Some Christians may be doing that, but by and large, that is simply not the case. The vast majority of God's people are not out trying to sow dissension. They're trying to lift up Christ. Now, the culture may see that and think we're their enemy. Nothing could be farther from the truth, but know this: if God begins to do something in your life or my life, people outside of here may see it in a very different way, and they may confuse our objectives. Guess what? That's okay. If you want to try to explain yourself, you can, but I would suggest that you might be wasting your breath. Trying to explain that's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to tell you about Jesus. Oh, wait, are you being so arrogant that you think Jesus is the only way to God? Are you trying to create an intolerant spirit in this? All over and over and over again, you see people confusing our objective. And our objective is to lift up Christ. And when God begins to move, people get confused about our objective. Look at verse 28. Now, when they had heard this, they being the craftsmen, when they had heard this speech, they were full of wrath. They're mad. Now, let me remind you, Paul had been preaching in Ephesus for 2 years. None of these guys cared anything about what didn't matter to them. Fine, preach, doesn't matter to me. The only time it changed was when it began to impact their vocation. It began to impact their office. It began to impact their community in very visible ways. I'm telling you, people don't care what we do inside this building on Sunday until it begins to impact the culture. We can meet Sunday morning till the cows come home. They don't care. But God help us. One thing I see about the ministry of Paul, they might hate him, they might love him, but they never could ignore him. The ministry of Jesus, they might hate him, they might love him when he was on the earth, but they never ignored him. God help us that we wouldn't be a church that sits here if people say, oh yeah, I don't even really know what goes on in that church, so there's a building there. I don't even know what's happening. That we would be so ineffective that nobody outside of these walls even knows what's going on here. God help us, whether people hate us or love us, God help us to be a church that they can't ignore. And so verse 28, when they heard this, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, great is Diana of the Ephesians. It gets crazy here in just a second. It gets really crazy. So the whole city was filled with confusion and rushed into the theater, which best estimates probably seated about 25,000 people in their theater. Very large place. Rushed into the theater with one accord, having seized Gaius and Aristarchus, Macedonians, Paul's travel companions. So they grabbed a couple of guys who had been working with Paul. They head into the theater. In verse 30, and when Paul wanted to go into the people, the disciples would not allow him. It's like, we got a theater full of folks. I'm going to go preach. Like, no, Paul, you can't do that because you won't come out alive. Let me ask you something. If we went out and set up a tent and began to preach or went out and ministered in the community and created a situation like this came up, that people were mad and angry at us for preaching the gospel, that people were unpleasant, how do you think the media would cover it? How do you think the media would portray us? How do you think the media would paint the church? Look, I'm not looking to go out and create trouble, but if in preaching the gospel it happens, have you seen it on TV where they paint the church, where they paint the gospel, where they paint preachers as either ignorant or hate-filled or unkind, and they attack? That's what the media is going to do. That's what's happening here. And yet, would anybody dare say that Paul had done the wrong thing by preaching the gospel in Ephesus? Verse 31. Then some of the officials of Asia, who were his friends, sent to him pleading that he would not venture into the theater. Let me point this out. Some of the officials of Asia, this group sometimes you read right through this. These are very high-level Asiatic people. In fact, one commentator I read talks about that these were probably wealthy people, connected people. So not only did Paul's fellow Christians not want him to go into the theater, these Asiarchs, as one commentator calls them, were friends of his, and they repeatedly urged him not to. The fact that Paul was that well connected in Ephesus is interesting to me. I think there's this idea that all the Jesus and the disciples and all the apostles, that everybody among them were just in poverty. And what you find is time and time again, God gives favor to a lot of these preachers and a lot of these apostles to be connected to high-level people. And often, time and time again, God will connect you with whom you need to be connected to. I see it happen all the time in a way. So these folks are trying to keep Paul from the theater as well. They know what's going on, and they're concerned for him. Verse 32, some therefore, that is, now we're back in the theater to those crying. Now the folks who are hollering in the theater. Some therefore cried one thing, some another, for the assembly was confused, and this is kind of a little bit of a sarcasm twinge, and most of them did not know why they had come together. Half of them didn't even know what they were there for. They just gathered together in a big mob, and on the evening news, Paul and his team create a mob. I can see it now. Paul and his team of the Way created a violent mob. I could see it on the evening news. I could see it online. I could see it on social media. 196 different comments, people talking about how wicked Paul is for creating all this unrest in the city. And all he had done is preach the gospel along the way. Let me suggest to you that sometimes when God's at work, the masses, and that is most of the people, may, what I call, confound the order. The masses may look at what we're doing, and they may completely confound what it is. That is, confuse it. That we're trying to create disorder or confusion. And I want to suggest to you that sometimes when the gospel is preached, that just happens. We don't look to create that. We don't look to provide that. I think about Paul in that Philippian prison earlier in the book of Acts, and the earthquake and the whole thing disrupts. That was confusion and craziness, but it was all God's plan. But then other times, it's just a very, very quiet, like when the church started in Philippi from the get-go, just a quiet prayer meeting on the side of the river. I don't know how God's going to work. Sometimes there's craziness, sometimes it's very quiet and mild, but the critical factor is when God is at work in a big way, people are going to probably confuse what we're trying to do and confound it along the way. I think about the way the media and the culture has confounded the gospel through the years, through TV. I go way back, all the way back to TV shows that are considered wholesome and considered good and all that, but how beginning in the 50s on up, how much the appearance of church, or how much the appearance of church in a positive light decreased time and time again. I remember watching the Waltons growing up. I don't know if you all remember watching that. It was Grandpa Walton. He was always seen as the great wise sage. Well, he was basically a deist. And John Ritter played the preacher, at least a lot of the time, and he was kind of a kook. And that's the way it portrayed it. I'm not trying to slam on the Waltons. I'm just saying what happened along the way. I remember the 1970s. Do you remember the first time, whether you liked him politically or not, Jimmy Carter was the first president to use the term born again about himself. And I don't know if you remember how the media reacted to that and made fun along the way as that kind of that slide continued, because the culture is going to confound what we're doing all the way along, all the way up to the 1990s and into now, where Christian characters on TV and movies, the vast majority of Christian characters on movies and TV are either some kind of psychopaths or sociopaths or weirdos or angry. I think, go back to the Waltons. How about Grandma Walton? Who wanted her sitting in the congregation? She was just mad all the time. And all through the years, as we've continued to see characters portrayed in the media that are Christians, they're portrayed in a very negative light. Look, it is what it is. I'm not complaining about it. I'm not griping about it. I'm just saying what is. And the what is, the reason that is because as the culture looks at what's happening and what God's doing, they confound what our intentions are. So look, Just keep trucking. Just keep sharing Christ. Just keep ministering, because I'm telling you, people on the outside are going to look. People at work might be offended and think you're too pushy. I don't mean be obnoxious, because that's a different story. But as you're sharing Christ, as you're living it out, they might not like what you're doing. Understand, that's just going to happen. The culture is going to confound what we're doing. And then look at verse 35. Verse 33. And they drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander motioned with his hand and wanted to make his defense to the people. But when they found out he was a Jew, all with one voice cried out for about 2 hours, "Great is Diana of the Ephesians." Now verse 35. And when the city clerk, that's kind of the guy in charge, the magistrate, if you will, he would be kind of the mayor of the city in this particular role. He quieted the crowd. You watch what he says. He's a good politician, by the way. He really does a pretty good job. "Men of Ephesus, what man is there who does not know that the city of the Ephesians is temple guardian of the great goddess Diana?" Right? Hey guys, everybody knows Diana is the best, right? What are we talking about? Everybody agrees with that. So he starts off with this real positive approach in his speech. "And of the image which fell down from Zeus," verse 36, "Therefore, since these things cannot be denied," I don't know why you're fussing. You can't deny that Diana is great. "You ought to be quiet and do nothing rashly. For you have brought these men here who are neither robbers of temples nor blasphemers of your goddess." He comes forward and says, look, Paul hasn't said anything against Diana. Paul hasn't said anything against your temple. All he's done is lift up Christ. So, good politician. First thing he does is acknowledge how great Diana is, but then he goes to the legality of it. We're gathered here in this gathering, this violent gathering, and the guys that you're bringing before us have done nothing illegal, which is probably far better than we might respond today. In today's culture, it seems that emotion wins the day over actual fact. That rather than actually putting forth facts and details, emotion wins the day in many of our conversations. And so he says, verse 38, "Therefore, if Demetrius and his fellow craftsmen have a case against anyone, the courts are open and there are proconsuls. Let them bring charges against one another." Demetrius was trying to just raise everyone's emotion and get them started. The city clerk says, look, we have laws here. We have a legal system. If they have issues, let them take them to court. Here's the problem, he says. Verse 39, "But if you have any other inquiry to make, it shall be determined in a lawful assembly. For we are in danger of being called into question for today's uproar, there being no reason which we may give to account for this disorderly gathering." Let me tell you about Rome. Rome oversaw this city. The Roman Empire was in charge, was in control. Rome pretty much left you alone as long as you did two things. One, pay your taxes. Number two, don't cause trouble. Pretty much as long as you handle those two things, you could do what you want as a city. But if there were illegal uprisings or protests or violent assemblies, Rome was going to come down hard on a city unless they had really, really good reason. And that's what the city clerk's saying. And so by verse 41, "And when he had said these things, he dismissed the assembly." Here's the beautiful thing. This city clerk, who doesn't show himself to be a Christian at all, gives the thing wide open for Christians now. If you can tell me anything these Christians have done to break the law, then take them to court. But if not, let's go home. So now they're all going home, and guess what? The Christians now have liberty to keep preaching. He stopped it all. And here's what often happens when you see an awakening. God will create an opportunity where the message itself will create true opportunity for believers. When God's at work somewhere, sometimes I think we wonder, how am I going to get my message out here? How am I going to go out into this area? How am I going to get it to take place here? What am I going to do about this? And all we need to be concerned with is doing what God's called us to do. And so often He'll open up the opportunities for us in ways we could not have even imagined. And that's what happens here. So by his speech, he established kind of a free area for Christians and disciples in Ephesus. So when you see the culture coming against us or the culture coming against you, know this. God's going to give you a way. You just keep trucking. God's going to give you an opening. See, when a spiritual awakening happens, when God begins to work in an area, it can cause unexpected changes and interruptions in a community along the way. I remember the day I was born again. Remember the day I was saved. I was thinking about that over the last couple of days. I had just graduated high school, and I was preparing to go to college. And my plans were to study business and to go out from there. Within weeks after my conversion, that changed when God directed me toward ministry. It's funny. That day of conversion, and then all my plans, all my vision for my life, it just began to change. The day I was born again, I had a group of friends that I'd hung around with since junior high school. We moved to Warner Robins when I was 12 years old. And all the way up through high school, I had a group of friends who I was tight with. It's a funny thing, after I got born again and God really saved me, it's funny how those friends just kind of changed. I didn't set out to change them, it just kind of changed. And so all the people that I'd been around before just began to change. The day I was born again, the vision I had for my future was business and sports and career. And within weeks, that all changed. Now, watch this. That was just me, one person. One person. I was one person who was saved, and all those things about my future and my vision, my plans changed. Imagine if 20 are born again, 100, 1,000. And all those people who just got born again, their vision of the future, their plans, or at least their motivation for what they do changes. Can you imagine how that changes a community, a church? God might do such a work here that we change the way we do ministry. God might do such a work around here that we change the way we go out into the community. But I'll tell you, the changes that we don't expect that create difficulties are well worth the awakening God might bring among us if we go out and do His will. And so this morning, here's the invitation. Number one, I'm going to invite you to come pray that God, or maybe just pray in your pews or come down front and pray that God would bring revival and awakening in this fellowship, that we would see it happen, even in this city. Maybe it starts with you. Maybe you need to come and find out how to be born again. I'm telling you, when I was saved, so much of what I did and my motives and my thoughts about my future changed. And I don't know if that's ever really happened to you, but if you've never truly been born again, today would be a great day. That'd be a great place to start. Maybe it's something else God's doing in your life. Maybe you want to come and say, Pastor, I believe God has me here at this fellowship to worship Him and serve Him and see, hopefully, revival come about through this fellowship and to be a part of it. Maybe you want to come and find out how to be a member of Green Acres. You come this morning. I'm going to pray and we're going to stand and you respond. Father, right now in Jesus' name, I'm asking you, Lord, to prompt us that we would obey you in these moments. You stand right where you are. You stand.